Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Never Thirst Again. I'm your podcast host, Chrissy Smith, and I'm so excited that you guys have decided to join me today. Before we begin, though, I do have to absolutely give you guys my sincere apologies. We were not able to get our podcasts out on last week, really due to a lot of scheduling conflicts that occurred. But guess what? We are right back in this thing for this week, and I'm so excited to talk to you guys today. I really want to focus on this podcast about what it means to have fear, but allowing God to turn that fear into good fruit. Now, in this podcast today, I come from a place of complete vulnerability and transparency. You may have heard me say a few podcasts ago that my husband is a newly ordained minister. I'm so proud of him. He was called to the ministry of Christ a few years ago and really has been going full speed ever since. Well, let me just take you guys back to the year 2020. Right when it seemed like the world was really starting to fall apart due to the pandemic. Everyone was masked up and practicing social distancing. We were all locked away in our homes, and for many of us, our attentions were glued to the news channels. Now, during this time, the Lord had been dealing with me, for quite a while about a number of things. And I remembered feeling really anxious, just very uneasy, and I couldn't really figure out why. Now, to add to this, ever since I was a kid, the Lord would send me prophetic dreams. Leading up to this time, though, I've been having several dreams about troubled waters ahead, but also within those dreams were wonderful, beautiful elements of protection and blood covering for me and my family. Now, once I realized that those dreams were filled with those two things, I was much more comfortable. But I was going to God constantly in prayer because I needed Him to make these things plain for me. I needed Him to make them clear so that I could understand what it was that He was trying to tell me. Because, in all honesty, I had no clue what was getting ready to happen. But I did know that I wanted to be prepared for what was ahead. Well, He prepared me all right. I remember about 3 days after having that last dream around this time, I noticed that my husband was looking a little spent, completely drained and tired. Even his complexion started to turn a little gray. And I could tell he just was not his usual self. And no shade to you men out there. I know it's usually difficult trying to get you guys to go to the doctor, but after convincing him, just for several hours, might I add, and I have to say, this is the shortest time it's ever taken for me to actually convince him to go see the doctor. But after I finally did do a little convincing, he went. And while he was there, they ran some blood tests. And because it was getting so late in the evening, they decided to send him back home just to stay there and await the results. Well, it wasn't until we had already put all three of the kids to bed and we were dragging ourselves into bed that Kelvin's phone rung. Now, it was the nurse's assistant for our doctor calling to let us know that his platelet levels were dangerously low. He needed to be admitted to the hospital immediately. And now, just to paint the picture for you, his platelets were so low that the medical team didn't even have a clue how he was still walking around and doing the things that he'd normally be doing. Specifically because this was something that affected your energy levels along with your inability to clot properly. There was so much more than this going on, but for now, I'm just going to focus on just this part. Now, that night was literally one thing after the next, and it seemed to all be happening so quickly. So, as soon as I got that call, I started making other calls to the prayer warriors that we knew would stand in the gap. I called both of our parents to let them know what was going on, and they immediately started making arrangements to drive up the next day. My brother and my sister in loves, they happened to be on their way home from a date night when I called to let them know what was going on. And within the next 15 minutes, they were pulling into our driveway to pick up the kids so that I could take Kelvin to the hospital. Now, our other two siblings, they were also trying to find ways to help as much as they possibly could too. So you could definitely say this was one of those moments where the entire village was pitching in to help where they could. Now, again, everything was happening so quickly, but it was definitely one of those nights where every detail sticks out in your mind. By the time we finally got to the hospital, we were told that at that point, no one was allowed in with the patient. Of course, due to COVID protocols that had been implemented, but no parent, no spouse, no child could enter, only the patient. So I ended up sitting in my car for hours on end, awaiting the news that his room had finally been prepared. We must have gotten to the hospital around 9:45 p.m., but honestly, it wasn't until about 5:30 in the morning that Kelvin called me from inside the hospital and said that they were transferring him to a bigger hospital downtown once they got everything else completed. Mind you, I was still sitting in that parking lot and I was exhausted. At that point, you could say I'd been awake for almost 24 hours. And so, in the time that passed, I took that slow drive back home and decided to at least try and take a nap before tidying up the house. And you know what? There was complete silence in the car. No radio, just me and God. I took that time to express my fears, my physical exhaustion, my mental exhaustion, and so many other things. But I also let him know that I was doing my absolute best to trust him in this moment. My husband was in the hospital, and I needed his strength to be supportive and nurturing for him and for our children. He reminded me of something, though. God repeated those words back in my head that really he had been trying to tell me the whole time through those dreams. Chrissy, remember, I told you that I would keep you and your family protected and covered. I've been preparing you for this, and all is well. So, my husband ended up being in that hospital for a full week before he was finally released. But here's the kicker: when he came out of there, he was a completely different man. He seemed peaceful, self assured, and completely immersed in a new sense of fullness with God. Now, I know that sometimes having a traumatic experience or a monumental event can sometimes be the perfect catalyst for thrusting you into the arms of God. And of course, I know that those things can happen. Like I said, it's not something that's unheard of. But a couple of weeks after coming out of the hospital, my husband came to me and he said, "Babe, I need to talk to you about something. You see, the Lord spoke to me about many things when I was in the hospital. And one of those things was this life of ministry. He told me that I'm supposed to enroll in seminary school. right now. Do you know those moments when you hear something unexpected and you feel like, I don't know, you feel like you black out for a minute? I really thought I'd blacked out for a second because those were not words that I was expecting to hear. And to be honest, I didn't want to hear them. My brain had already jumped 10 steps ahead in picturing myself sitting on the front pew wearing a traditional Southern First Lady hat. You know the ones I'm talking about, with all the shiny embellishments on there and making sure that our children were perfectly seated beside me in neat outfits and well groomed hairstyles. In my mind, my husband was already standing in the pulpit, delivering a sermon to blow the roof off the church. I thought about how, with him being a minister, I now had to remain prim and proper at all times while making sure that I didn't make any wrong moves that would subject us to critical judgment from the people. Every single stereotype that I could possibly think of had popped into my head. I felt like as soon as an announcement would be made that he was on his way to being a part of the clergy, there would be a heightened sense of awareness where I felt like it automatically opened us up for unwanted opinions, judgments, and other things that I just simply was not ready for. Long story short, I did not want this. I wanted no part of it. Now, did I voice that? No. Here my husband was, excited and ready to dive into this thing headfirst, and I was still standing on the shores, apprehensive about dipping my feet, even in the shallow end. I mean, of course, I was saved and I was absolutely in a place of loving God, but this was something different. My husband and I were married, and this wasn't something that he could say yes to and I could say no to. We were one, and this is something that would affect both of us. The other thing was that there really wasn't a place for, hey, let's compromise. How about enrolling in 2 years when life has just slowed down a little bit for us? Mm-mm. That wasn't going to work either. When someone tells you that they've been called to ministry and your spirit has truthfully discerned that in that moment you know it to be so, there really is no room for compromise. God's work must be done in His timing, and whenever He tells you to move, it must be done. Your feelings and opinions are not taken into consideration. And I think that was the hardest pill that we had to swallow. And by we, I mean me. You see, the thing is, I knew that. I understood that. But it doesn't mean that I was automatically on board with it. I couldn't even argue about it because I felt that I had no grounds to argue on. Again, God had spoken, and I couldn't push His instructions for my husband aside. However, I did have to go to God and be truthful with Him about what I was feeling. And boy, was that a process. Forcing myself not to shut down whenever my husband would tell me about the classes he'd be taking or the community projects that he needed to take part in for credits. That was just so difficult in the beginning. However, I slowly started to come around. I'd become more interested as the time passed by and asked more questions to show that my level of support was increasing little by little. God began to reveal a few things to me in this process, though, just with this whole thing. Now, the first thing was this: I had to understand that He was saying, Chrissy, this is not about you or your husband. Even though you're making it about you, it's not. This is about me and how I'm using a willing vessel to build up my kingdom. Boy, talk about a humbling moment. It wasn't about me, but it was indeed about God. That's when I realized how selfish I was being throughout this whole thing. I was grateful that my husband was home and physically back to himself after coming out of the hospital, but I was not accepting the fullness of his spiritual transformation at the time because, of course, that would also mean that I'd accepted the will of God and the instructions that He'd given him, and I didn't. That was what the reflection staring at me in the mirror had revealed. The second thing was this. With all the concerns that I had went to God with, He wasn't telling me that those things weren't important or that my feelings were irrelevant. He never even said that judgment wouldn't come our way. However, He simply reminded me that whatever I encounter, He has loved me enough to give me everything I need to handle it with grace. Being a lover of people isn't always easy, but during those times when I have to reach down and lean into Him just a little bit more while trusting the process, He's reminded me that He will absolutely be right there. And lastly, this one was a biggie. The Lord had revealed to me that even though He has called my husband to the ministry of preaching the Gospels to the people, the role of being his wife throughout this transformative process was now a transformation for me too. He's making ways for me to put my gifts on display as well. However, in regards to my husband, I find myself praying for him like never before. Now I know that each journey is different, but for us, I've noticed that He is at His best when He is calm and peaceful in His spirit. So, that being said, I know that when I'm providing the highest level of support, whenever He's disappointed, frustrated, or even when He needs a little extra encouragement, it means something. Whenever I'm providing the best balance of both work and availability for our family, it's helping to serve a higher purpose in our home and in our marriage too. And of course, companionship is always there because we must remain strengthened so that our foundations are not easily shaken. Being His place of calm and stability is what helps him to stay grounded through this type of love and sacrifice that only a wife can give. So, in saying all of this, again, I am reminded that God has given me a special role in addition to what He has called my husband to do. Will it be difficult sometimes? Yeah, but again, God has given us everything that we need to handle it with grace and love as long as we keep His presence in the midst. Well, to all of my listeners and friends out there, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. I'll see you back here soon. And don't forget to subscribe to Never Thirst Again. You may do this by going through Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and also Spotify. Thanks again for tuning in today. Take care and God bless.